Hello, I'm Lucatorix and welcome to my Denmark faction guide for Medieval 2 Total War. Today we're going to be discussing the Danish units and some campaign strategy for the Grand Campaign. So, Denmark, very interesting faction. One of my favourite factions. They're really quite a strong faction if you use them right as well. Now, their starting position is the red region, the highlighted region, which guess what is basically the same as modern day Denmark. It's this region around here. So, they are a rarity in the fact that they start off with one settlement, which is not the only faction that starts off with one settlement, but it is quite rare. I mean, Scotland is an example of another one. But they are in a unique position where a sort of semi-unique position where they don't really start off with a big empire, but they have the potential to expand, of course. Now, their strengths, they have a good all-round mix of units, with the infantry preferring to wield swords or axes instead of spears, which is very interesting. So, a more offensive, direct, hardy faction, and more infantry-based, but a very strong roster. That's for sure. Their weaknesses: lacks good heavy cavalry. That's basically their only weakness. So, you know what, when you have infantry that looks like that, sometimes you don't always need cavalry, and Denmark is an example. Now, if you want to win the long campaign, you have to hold 45 regions, including the Jerusalem region, which is in the Middle East around here. It starts off as a rebel settlement. So, Denmark is Catholic. That's something to take into account when expanding, but basically, there are only Catholic factions around, apart from the nearest non-Catholic faction is Russia. So really, it's kind of inevitable that you're going to have to attack a Catholic faction at some point. But we'll discuss that in a minute. First of all, we're going to have a look at the Danish units, and I'll kind of just review them. So these are the Danish units, and they are really quite emblazoned with bright red. I like that. And we're going to start off with the Peasants. Now, as Peasants go, these guys aren't actually that bad. If you remember last week, when I showed my Egypt faction guide, the Peasants were like 1 attack, 1 defense. Still, these Peasants are not amazing. Their attack is 4, defense of 3, and really they are only a good 4 cannon fodder. But, I mean, they have very low stats. Their poor morale means they'll break in an instant. They are unwilling fighters. They're farmers, damn it. But, you know, nobody is really going to be relying on Peasants. That's not a problem. Combat bonus in woods or snow is quite a cool thing, but really these Peasants are nothing amazing at all. Next up, we have Town Militia. Now, Town Militia, really only a small step up from Peasants. Their attack is 5, defense of 7. It's a more defensive unit. They are armed with a spear rather than, what is that, like a trident or something? Anyway, they are sort of a slightly more defensive unit. They are okay at defending settlements, but in the early game, but they are nothing amazing at all. Really, they are just used for garrison. But, I mean, you know, a 7 defense is not terrible. They'll do a competent job if really relied upon, but to be honest, I wouldn't recommend it. Instead, how about you go for some Viking Raiders? Now, as I said, the faction of Denmark, it really does revolve around more offensive units. That's really why these are basically the only spearmen you're going to get. But you're not going to be relying on them. You're going to be using axemen or swordsmen. And the first example of axemen are Viking Raiders, and their attack is 9, their defense is 9 as well. So you can see, superior to the Town Militia, almost double the attack of the Town Militia, because they're a more offensive unit, and they're armed with an axe. Now, their armor is only light, so that's okay in the early game, but to be honest, in the later game that will not stand up, but you're going to be using better troops in the later game anyway. But the fact they have good stamina means they will stand and fight for quite a while, and 9 attack, 9 defense is not terrible, nothing amazing either, but it's okay in the early game. So now we'll get on to the Spear Militia. Now, I did actually say that there were not many spearmen. I mean, there are some spearmen, but to be honest, these guys are very similar to the Town Militia. In fact, almost identical. The only difference really that I can see is that they can form a Skiltrum, which is a defensive formation, makes them more compact basically, and makes them better at fighting cavalry, but very similar to the Town Militia. Okay in the early game, nothing special, won't be used that much in the late game, that's for sure. Instead, I'd rather talk about the swordsmen, particularly the Norse swordsmen. So well-armed and well-equipped Norse swordsmen, able to wear chain and plate armour. So this is where you really start to see the high defense come in. And although these guys are quite an offensive unit, you're going to be using to charge forward most of the time, rather than stand in a Skiltrum and fight against cavalry, waiting for them to charge into you. These guys still have a very good defense, and that is because the Danes have mastered the art of armour, and that means they have an 18 defense. 18! Which, if you compare them to a unit I labelled defensive earlier, well, they have an 11 better defense. So these guys are really, really solid. They are going to stand and they're going to fight, because that's what the Danes do pretty much. But still, they have an 11 attack, which is an improvement from the Viking Raiders. So really, Norse swordsmen are a very, very solid unit. Obviously, they're good at combat bonus in woods or snow. There's no good morale or good stamina, interestingly, so they are inferior to later troops. But these guys will do a solid job, that is for sure. And they're high defense. Any unit with high defense, you know they're going to stand and fight for a while, and therefore they are useful. Let's get on to Sword Staff Militia. So, Sword Staff wielding militia, armoured in plate. So again, these guys, rather than chain, they've got plate armour, but they've got armour. Now, their attack of 7 and defense of 10 is nothing particularly amazing, to be honest, but they can form a spear wall, which makes their defense, which is only 10, actually a lot better in reality, because they're just harder to break down. It's harder to penetrate through the line, particularly with cavalry I'm thinking of as well. So they can form a spear wall, they're effective against armour. Now that becomes increasingly important later on in the game as well, because of course more units, for example a lot of the European units that have knights are going to have better and better armour as the game progresses, and you're going to need something to combat that. So a unit like Sword Staff Militia that can actually combat and that is effective against armour is going to do a solid job against the later period units, which these guys are not going to do as well. They have very long spears, and the interesting thing about the very long spears are, or swords in this case, it's kind of weird, is the fact that they are, of course, and especially in the spear wall, they're harder to get through. Again, it's harder to penetrate the line, because if you're charging into a long spear, then you are physically further away from each troop, so you're gonna have to inflict more damage on yourself to physically get to them, or you're gonna have to sort of maneuver yourself to get around the back of them or whatever, which is going to cause complications for the enemy. So the fact that these guys are really quite defensively set, even if their stats don't look amazing, actually means that they are pretty damn good indeed. Very, very good at defending a settlement, I would say. Then we get on to Dismounted Feudal Knights. Now these guys are where it really starts to come into play that the Danes know what they're doing, particularly in terms of infantry. So their attack is 13, best we've seen so far. Defense of 21, best we've seen so far. And that's because basically they have really, really good armour and stuff. So they're well armoured, good morale. It's the first time we've seen good morale as well. And good morale, very, very important. It means that, of course, units are going to fight for longer. They're not going to break as quickly. And, of course, you know, like in the Total War games, if one unit breaks, it can quite often have a domino effect where a lot of other units break. So these guys are going to stand and hold their line, even if other units are breaking around them, which is really, really important. And units like these can really win a battle for you, purely because you just have the staying power more than your enemy. And these guys can pack a punch as well, because they have 13 attack and a pretty damn badass sword. So really, these guys are very, very solid as well. Great unit of infantry, I would say, for sure. And you can get them relatively early on as well, which is a bonus. Bonus for sure. Now we get the Dismounted Chivalric Knights. Very similar, honestly, but their defense is slightly better. They're really well armored. I mean, just look at them. Would you want to fight that in a battle? I wouldn't. I wouldn't want to fight that in a battle, okay? So, yeah, these two units, pretty solid indeed. I'm a big fan. Now we're going to get on to the Dismounted Hussars. So, protected by mail armour and wielding axes, these fearsome warriors are excellent killing machines. And they really are. They're an early unit, but despite being an early unit, they are armoured, which is like amazing. It means really gives you an advantage in the early period. That's the great thing about the Danish faction, is that their units, their infantry is so superior, particularly in the early game. You can really garner an advantage over your enemies early on, whereas other factions don't have that privilege, that advantage. So their attack is 11, their defense is 15, which again is very, very solid, particularly for a unit which I would label as offensive. They are killing machines. The game describes them as killing machines, as opposed to a defensive unit that's going to stand in a wall of spears. The game describes them as killing machines, but they will keep alive for a long time, especially coupled with that good morale as well. So Dismounted Hussars, I am a fan of as well. Now we're getting on to more Axemen. Now these are the really, really quite offensive units. And Norse Axemen is an example of that, because they have two-handed axes. Pretty badass indeed. Two-handed axes. These guys are heavy troops, and they really, really do pack a punch. I'm not joking. They really, really do. So these guys are basically used to, at an opportune moment, charge in and just chop the heads off of their enemies. I mean, they really do not mess around in that regard. 17 attack coupled with a charge bonus of 6, and that's what I said, that initial charge is going to do a huge amount of damage, and not only physical damage but mental damage as well. The morale of troops and surrounding troops is going to suffer, so they really are a shock impact unit that's going to do a huge amount of damage. Now, They're effective against armour, so they're going to be useful in the late game as well. Combat bonus in woods or snow, which guess what? You're going to be fighting in Europe for the majority of the games, so that's pretty cool indeed. Good morale, well armoured, good stamina. Even though they have a really good charge, they're going to be good at fighting for a long time as well. Norse Axemen will do a huge amount of damage, and if you're any unit in the game, even if you're a strong defensive unit, you do not want to be going against these guys because of the pure amount of physical and mental damage these guys do. Norse Axemen are really quite elite in terms of the Axemen. They're really good stuff, and it's one of the reasons why Denmark is such a fun faction to play as. Now we're going to go on to Obershire, I think that's how you say it, Obershire. They're basically halberds. Skilled halberd unit, armoured in plate armour. So 9 attack, 12 defence. They can form a spear wall. So they are rather good defensively in that regard, which I discussed earlier. The spear wall makes them more compact and harder to penetrate the line. Good morale, very long spears. Now, this I discussed last episode in my Egypt faction guide as well. The very long spears is important because it means you're physically further away from your enemies. So again, it's even harder to penetrate the line because the spears are longer. You know, you're going to be less vulnerable from the front. So a fantastic unit again. Obershire, I like them. A good defensive unit that can also pack a punch. I mean, who wouldn't want that, right? Now we're going to get onto the missile units. We're going to start off with Crossbow Militia, which is an interesting unit to start off with. I would have thought they would start off with Peasant Archers, but it's alright. We'll start off with Crossbow Militia if you want to. So Crossbow Militia are peasant crossbowmen called up to defend settlements, very poorly armoured. Well, they might be poorly armoured. They might have only a melee stats of 2, 1, and 1 respectively. Okay, fair enough. But it's their missile attack which is really the important thing. It doesn't matter that much that they can't fight in hand-to-hand combat. That's not really their specialty, especially if you're Denmark. You have so many good units that can fight hand-to-hand combat, you're not going to be using Crossbow Militia anyway, so it's fine. But Crossbow Militia, 9 missile attack, which is pretty solid indeed. We're going to have a look at some of the archers in a minute. That is superior to a lot of the other archers in the game. So, well, these are crossbows, so that's why they are better, obviously. And they will do a very solid job. I mean, there's not a huge amount to say about them. They will do a solid job. They will stand there and they will fire missiles and they will inflict damage upon the enemy. And I quite like that. So a nice compliment to some of these units for sure. You know, if you think about it. I'm sorry if I sound a little bit ill, by the way. I am still a little bit ill. So, I am making this video out of the kindness of my heart. But, you know, I'm suffering through it because, yeah, I'm feeling a little bit ill. But anyway, enough about me. The really cool thing about the archers in Denmark is it's the perfect complement because you get an army in front of you and you can just soften them up with missiles, you can lower their morale, just chunk them down a little bit, and then you bring in the two-handed axemen and they just completely cut down. So really Denmark has a perfect balance of infantry where you have the units that can weaken them and then the guys to actually finish the job, do the damage, rout the men and chop their heads off. So just wanted to say that Denmark is really strong in that regard. Anyway, we're going to go on to Peasant Archers next. So, Peasant Archers are obviously inferior to Crossbow Militia. They have an missile attack of 5. They have the same melee attack, but I'm not concerned about the melee at all. Their missile attack is not very good, but that's because they are archers as opposed to crossbowmen. So they're less sort of organised, their weapon is less powerful. But to be honest, in the early game, if you want someone just to guard assessment, inflict some damage from a height, maybe on top of a wall of a castle or whatever, then yeah, Peasant Archers will do an okay job in the early game, but they're nothing special, and obviously crossbowmen are better. Talking of crossbowmen, let's have a talk about them. So, they are slow to reload, but a potent and easy use missile weapon, firing powerful bolts, and you know, that's why they're better than archers. So, very similar to these guys that you see the Crossbow Militia. The main difference really is that they are actually slightly competent in the melee. They have an attack of 6 and a defense of 8. Now that can be a little bit useful because as a last resort, if they are like the last line of defense for a city, then it means that they can do a little bit of damage and they can hold their own. But honestly, again, like I said, you've got so much good infantry, you're never going to be using crossbowmen unless there is some sort of dire emergency circumstance in the melee. So to be honest, not too much of a concern. The missile attack means they're a pretty solid unit. Now we're going to get on to arquebusiers. I think I'm saying that right. And they are commonplace for a lot of the European factions, in fact. And they're pretty good, that's why. So fired at close range, this noisy, smoky and lethal weapon causes morale damage as well as physical hurt. So Let's have a look at the stats first. So the missile attack is 14. If you compare them to the Crossbow Militia, where they had a missile attack of 9, obviously they're superior. But this is a gun powder weapon, so it's obviously going to be superior in that regard. But really, as the game kind of alludes to, the smokiness and the noise of the weapon itself causes the morale damage. So really, that works both ways in the fact that the enemies are going to be severely weakened mentally but also physically by these guys. So they kind of have a two-pronged attack, and that makes these guys particularly strong. Now, not long range at all, so that's a little bit awkward, but to be honest, that's perfectly fine. They are going to, and this is what I said, the perfect coupling up of missile and infantry. They're going to do a job where they're going to destroy the morale of the enemy, and then the infantry is going to come in and finish the job. So that's what these guys are for, and they will do a damn good job of it as well. Now we're going to go back to archers. It's a weird order they put them in this episode. It's not my fault. Anyway, these archers are pretty good, and in fact a rarity to see. Pretty good was a bit of an understatement, by the way, for archers. It's a rarity to see archers with this amazing melee attack and defense. So the early period Norse Archers, which has a missile attack of 7, so they're better than the Peasant Archers. They're not as good as the Crossbow Militia, but they're archers, so you've got to take that into consideration. That their weapon is not physically as good, but still they're archers, and a lot of factions have inferior archers to that, so take that into consideration. The main thing which is amazing about them is that really, even if you take the missile attack away from them, they're a solid melee infantry units. Their attack is 11, their defense is 16, so very, very solid stats, comparable to many other factions with their early or even mid-game heavy or light infantry. I mean, very, very solid stats indeed. And as I said, it's not vital for missile troops to have this melee attack and defense, but it's a nice touch, and it also means that if a unit has run out of missiles, they're not completely useless on the battlefield. They can actually inflict a bit of damage as well. So Norse Archers sort of engendering the spirit of the Danish culture, I suppose, and actually are willing to get down and fight, and I like that. Now we're going to get onto the final infantry units, the hand gunners. The earliest handheld firearm unit causes more fear than actual damage. These soldiers need to be capable in close combat due to the short range of their weapons. That pretty much summarises it well, to be honest. They have a missile attack of 13, which is pretty solid indeed, but also a melee and defense of 11 and 13 respectively. So they will be fighting hand to hand, so it's more important for these guys as opposed to the archers, which are more long range, to have that melee combat, and they have decent melee combat as well. So the game pretty much summarised it well. I'll give them credit for that. Let's get on to the cavalry. Now, the game described the heavy cavalry of the the Danish faction to be relatively weak, and we'll sort of discuss that now. So first of all, we have scouts, and this is actually a bit of light cavalry. So cheap to recruit and equip, scouts are useful for running down fleeing troops and scattering archers. Again, pretty good summary. They are faster than a lot of heavy cavalry. In fact, they're faster than all heavy cavalry. An attack of 7 and defense of 11 is nothing too bad, but you're not going to be using them to break down a line of troops. You don't need them to, because you have such good infantry. They're never going to be involved in a long melee before a troop has routed or been broken, because they are not going to be used to be broken, because you've got plenty of units like swordsmen and axemen to break down units. The scouts are just used to really make sure that once the heavy infantry has done their job, that all the guys get killed and they don't run away. Okay, so the scouts are very, very good at doing that. Then we get on to merchant cavalry militia, poorly trained but well equipped cavalry who fight with a sword. Nothing amazing, attack of 6 and defense of 14. There isn't a huge amount to say about them, but there you go, there's the stats. They're poorly trained, and I don't like poorly trained men. Sorry, that's how I work. Now we're getting on to Hussars. Now Hussars are good indeed. Protected by mail armour and wielding axes, these fearsome warriors are effective cavalry. You don't say, because actually they're early period cavalry with a defense of 16. So that's very, very high indeed. In fact, 16 for any type of cavalry at any period is pretty solid indeed, and 11 attack as well. And as I said, sort of contrastingly to the previous two units, who are not capable of fighting for a long time in the melee, these guys are actually, because they have a good morale. They will stand up and fight and pack a punch for a long time. Now, You don't really need them to do that because you have a lot of infantry, but just in case you maybe need a shock charge or whatever, because they have a charge bonus of 4, which is pretty decent. Just in case you need a shock charge from some cavalry, because cavalry is always useful. Don't care what faction you are, cavalry can always be useful. Then Hussars will certainly do that job very, very effectively. I like them. And axe-wielding cavalrymen, like, who wouldn't want that? You know, they're pretty cool. Now we're going to get on to Feudal Knights. Again, another really, really cool unit. They are heavy armor protected men with a lance. They're elite warriors, crushing and riding down their opponents. Attack of 10, defense of 16, and a charge bonus of 6, so even higher than the Hussars, which we just saw. They may charge out orders, so they're a little bit disorganized, but good morale, well armored. At least you know if they do charge out orders, they're going to stay alive, most likely, because they actually can hold and stand their ground. So that's quite nice indeed. Now we're getting on to some Norse War Clerics, heavily armoured bishop and cavalry retinue, encased in plate armour and wielding foe-crushing maces. Wow. Wow, maces, love it. So, attack of 10, defense of 19 again, as I said earlier. 19 defense is pretty good. And to be honest, the game is rather critical of its heavy cavalry. I think the Danish heavy cavalry is pretty good. So, I would largely ignore that. I think in the early game maybe you could say yeah, because it's mostly scouts and merchant cavalry militia, which are inferior to a lot of the early game cavalry of other factions. But in the late game, these guys, they can certainly do a job. They're not terrible, because the 19 defense means that they, and good morale means they're going to stand up for a long time, and you have the infantry anyway. But you know, these guys are pretty good. Now we're going to get onto the Bodyguards next. So the Bodyguards obviously are good, very similar to most of the European factions. Attack of 13, defense of 16, charge bonus of 8, which is very, very high indeed. These guys are meant to protect your general, and they'll do a damn good job of it in the early game as well. And then you have the late game period ones, which are basically very, very similar, just they have very good stamina and they have 17 defense, so just very, very slightly higher. But these guys are the elite of the elite, and their stats prove that, basically. They are used to protect the most important members of your family. Now, there's even more cavalry, believe it or not. There's Knights Hospitalier. I think I'm saying that right. They are well trained and disciplined. These knights are amongst the deadliest heavy cavalry in all of Christendom. 13 and 16 are very, very solid stats indeed. Coupled with a charge bonus of 8, these guys can do a good job as sort of shock cavalry as well. They can really turn the tide of battle, and any unit, any cavalry unit particularly, with a high charge bonus added onto them, means that they can rout and break units, and it's just that essential point in the battle where, you know, it's teetering, it could go either way. One charge can make all the difference, and this is the kind of unit which is just going to charge in and make that difference, so that's pretty cool. Okay, up next are the Knights Templar, elite and some say reckless knights, formed to protect Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. Now, as a sort of generalization, any unit fighting for a religion particularly, like Knights Templar, are going to be good because they're just committed, okay? Very similar, actually, to the previous units, but these guys are sort of a less organised version, you could argue, but they are really quite powerful. But they may charge out orders because they're doing it in the name of God, okay? And God is a higher commander to these people than any one of your family members. I'm sorry to break that to you, but these guys, even if they do charge, they're going to do a solid job, even if you didn't want them to charge. So, Knights Templar, very, very good stuff. And then we get on to Chivalric Knights. Even better, because they have a high defense stat. They have a ferocious charge. They're clad in steel plate armor. There's not a huge amount more to say than there's a pretty good heavy cavalry, and I disagree with the game when it says that there isn't, quite frankly. Now, what there isn't is a lot of missile cavalry. That I will freely admit, there is not a lot of missile cavalry, and this is a rare example of missile cavalry that the Danish faction can have, and they are mounted crossbowmen. Missile attack of only 5 if you compare them to these crossbowmen, which have a missile attack of 9, so, you know, not quite as good, but decent in the melee, 7 and 10 respectively in attack and defense. It's okay for missile troops. It's certainly, you know, it's relatively solid, but yeah, I have to admit, with the Danish faction, there's no javelinmen or anything like that, which you're going to get with the African faction. So, you know, I mean, this is a slightly less agile and versatile army maybe, but boy, do they fight, and they fight hard. They fight hard, okay? So, you know what? You have advantages and disadvantages. If you play these guys right, then they are like an unstoppable fighting force. Now, the only other units are basically like siege equipment, like cannons and so forth, so on and so forth. And I discussed these in great detail in my England faction guide. So it's basically the same for all the European factions. So if you want to go and see what I have to say about all this stuff, then go to my England faction guide where I discussed it in more detail. I just don't want to repeat myself every episode, basically. So these are the Danish units, and I think we are now ready to look at some strategy on the campaign map. And here we are. This is Denmark's starting position, and as I said at the beginning of the episode, there is only one territory. It's Aarhus. I think I'm saying that right. I mean, I don't know. I actually thought Aarhus had 2 A's in the spelling of it, but apparently not. I think I'm saying that right. But anyway, this is a starting settlement, which is basically the borders of now modern-day Denmark. It's very, very interesting that it's almost the same. You have a few units in here. Aarhus, of course, being a large town. So there's a few units in here. Sorry about that. King Knud, I don't know. I'm not going to say names. That's a bad idea. There's a few units in here. We have an army of Prince Charles along here, and then we have an army of Captain Harken over here. That's pretty much it. We have a couple of other sort of merchants and whatever, but that is your army. You have one boat. It's Admiral John with 25 ships, and that's it. Start off with. So you start off with humble beginnings. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the fog of war. The reason isn't to cheat or anything like that. I don't play with the fog of war off. The only reason I'm doing it is to show you where everything is, so I can explain in more detail where I would and wouldn't expand in the early game. So now that's off, we can now see what's going on. And what is going on? Well, to the north, there are a few rebel Scandinavian settlements, Oslo and Stockholm, modern-day Norway and Sweden, and Helsinki, modern-day Finland. So there's a little bit of rebel territory to the north, but obviously there is an infinite void above you, which we won't discuss. It's not very geographically correct. But anyway, there is not a huge amount to expand in this direction. Now to the south you have the might of the Holy Roman Empire, along with factions like France, a little bit of England, Poland and Hungary, but also a lot of rebel territory like Hamburg, Stettin, Magdeburg, Thorn, etc. Now, there are several ways you can do this. There is one way, which is take all the rebel settlements, particularly Hamburg. You'll start off with Hamburg as a rebel castle. So if you take the castle, it's easier to defend from the Holy Roman Empire when you inevitably go to war with them. Taking Stettin, Magdeburg, and basically eventually building up enough force either to take on Poland, or more likely, because they're probably going to be aggressive, to take on the Holy Roman Empire. Now, you can do that. I personally wouldn't. And the reason is because, let's say, for example, you're good at the game. You take the rebel settlements and then you expand into Holy Roman Empire territory. You're going to have the same problem that the Holy Roman Empire has, which is you're in the middle of Europe and your empire is going to look very much sort of like a vertical column, and you're going to be surrounded by a lot of potential enemies, all of whom are Catholic, so you can't really attack all of them unless you want to get excommunicated, and you're going to be in the middle of Europe with a lot of trouble and probably a lot of wars and a lot of threat. Now, you can play the game like that. I personally wouldn't do that. I would really actually probably try and get an alliance with the Holy Roman Empire, if anything, or just try and maintain peace. Hamburg maybe you can go for. Stettin maybe you can go for, but don't overextend. Don't focus too much on this territory, because honestly, they're not amazing. I mean, this is like a Motte and Bailey. Okay, they're not very big settlements. They're not very profitable settlements. There are better settlements and more defensible settlements elsewhere. So where would I go? Well, here is where I'd go. I would firstly claim Scandinavia as my own, Stockholm and Oslo, because this is a relatively defensible region. It is essentially an island. Not quite, because you can get through it through your own territory, but no one's going to be coming through Aarhus. If they're coming through Aarhus to get to Oslo and Stockholm, you've got big trouble. So it's essentially an island, because you can't get over here, and you can't go into the voids to get over, like you could in real life by going through Finland to Sweden. So this is essentially island territory. And island territory is very defensible, because you have to have a ship to get there. Now, unless the Russians are very, very persistent, and the Russians, I believe, do not start off with any sort of navy, really, this is pretty safe territory. You have a ship, other factions don't. So if you take Oslo and Stockholm, you can slowly build them up, and they're just 2 settlements you can have early on. But obviously, once you take Oslo and Stockholm, you can't really expand into the depths of hell. So where are you going to expand? Well, I would expand towards the British Isles. I would get my boat of Admiral John. Bear in mind you have a port, so you can recruit more than just Admiral John. I would get my boat, send all my armies, or most of my armies, leaving some garrison over here, maybe to defend this territory, just in case the Holy Roman Empire do get stupid ideas. But I'd bring the majority of my force over here and attack the shores of the British Isles. Now, I'd firstly probably focus on England, and that would be the first Catholic faction that I would attack. Now, I would focus on the early game, focus on claiming modern day Great Britain as your own. And the reason is, first of all, maximum, you're going to go to war with 2 Catholic factions. Maximum, okay? Because Scotland and England are here. You're not going to be going to war with about 4, or potentially like 5, if you expand in this direction. So, excommunication is less of a threat if you go this way. But also, once you claim the British Isles or modern day Britain, again, you have a relatively defensible region. You have about solid 7 or 8 settlements which are on islands. Now, yes, the French could come over by boat, but it's a rarity, okay? It's you know, they're more likely to expand in the easier to get to territory. So the French are going to be less of an issue. The Holy Roman Empire are going to be less of an issue. And what you'll find is, in the early game, you'll have quite a substantial empire with some really quite big areas. Like London is a big old place, and so is Nottingham. So you can get a good economy going, and bear in mind, settlements that are islands have good economy because they have access to ports and sea trade more than somewhere like Magdeburg would, for example, because it's inland. So you can have a large empire which is highly defensible and profitable. To me, it makes so much sense to do what I explained more than going around here, because it's going to economically benefit you, and it's going to militarily and strategically benefit you as well. And also you're going to avoid excommunication more so if you go down this route. So that's my basic advice. After that, it's surveying the map. It depends on your campaign, but just pick one faction and go for them, whether it's France or whether it's the Holy Roman Empire or Poland, and just you've got to eliminate them. That's sort of a later game kind of thing, but my opening moves certainly would be going through Scandinavia and then going through Britain, for the reasons I explained. But it's up to you. There are several methods of doing it. So that's basically my advice for Denmark in Medieval 2 Total War. I hope you enjoyed. I'm sorry I did sound a little bit ill. I can't help that, but I thought you'd rather get a video out, and I tried my best to be expressive, so I hope that was alright. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. There'll be more content coming out very, very soon, and I'll see you around.